Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first of our courses for 2024 on CyberOps. We're, of course, going to do what we always do and leave it for about 5 minutes for everybody to shuffle into the room here. I can see that the numbers are filling up pretty quickly. But if I had hold music, I would put it on for you. But at the moment, just give it about 5 minutes and then we'll come back on. Lil will send messages through the chat as well. Feel free to have a chat amongst yourselves on the chat channel and see what else is going on, and let us know where you're all from as well, which country you're from and what you're up to on this, what is a wet day down here in Melbourne where we're coming from. I'll be speaking to you soon. So for those of you who are just joining, we'll be starting in a couple of minutes. We're just letting everybody come into the room. I can see there's a couple of hundred of you already on board, so we're only a minute or so away. Okay, I think probably the bulk of people are here already. I'd like to welcome everybody again for joining us for the first of our 4-week course, an introduction to CyberOps, based around the Cisco certification. It's a short course that's presented by us at IT Masters on behalf and in conjunction with Charles Sturt University. My name's Shane Murphy, and I'll be your MC for this webinar, and not for the duration of this course. The very special Jack Stewart will be coming along, I think, from next week onwards for the final 3 weeks. Your mentor, of course, is the inimitable Matt Constable, who has done quite a number of these courses for us and also would be well known to anybody who's done any of our paid courses. Matt has been with us for many years and does a fantastic job. Wherever you're watching this, and we see people from Nigeria and Ghana and Townsville, where hopefully they're not in the middle of a cyclone soon, and Rwanda, all over the place, Pakistan. We hope you're all safe and well and having a good day or a good night or a good morning. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. I'll blather on about that. All webinars in this course will be held at 8 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time because it's our daylight savings era, so it might be a bit out of sync with what you're normally used to. We make recordings for those of you who cannot attend on any of the nights, and they'll be available usually within 24 hours of the end of the session. Despite the recordings, we do like you to be along and make the sessions live because you can interact with everybody and maybe contribute, ask some questions, see what other people have got to ask as well. As always, we use Zoom for our webinars and encourage you to ask questions and to chat amongst yourselves all the time. Lil will be there in the chat, giving you all sorts of little bits of information and tips along the way. And if there are administration type questions, dates, times, resources, etc., you put that just in the chat and Lil will make sure that it gets answered at some point. You can, or if you want to, you can actually ask questions of the panelists, in which case you then put that in the Q&A section. Make sure in the chat as well, of course, that you toggle down to send all your messages to everyone, not to hosts and panelists. You can send them just to hosts and panelists, but everybody else won't be able to see it then. They're usually very experienced attendees. Some people have sat up to 20 or 30 of our courses, and they will often help you with queries if we miss you along the way. And often they'll have lots of insights to augment the content as well. We will have Q&A sessions at the end of the webinars, and we will probably pause a couple of times during the course of the discussion to interject a few questions that seem relevant. Always seems a better way to do it so that we don't forget what's going on. For those of you who have never taken part in one of our short courses, welcome. IT Masters is a training organisation that exists to partner with Charles Sturt University, and we work with them to create and deliver a number of master's degrees in IT and some graduate certificates as well. We also do a lot of the marketing of these courses, and one of the reasons that we do the free short courses is to give people both a way of testing what our content's like and how we deliver our courses, because this is exactly the same way that we deliver our master's courses. And hopefully by trying it before you actually join, you might be encouraged then to do one of our more full-on master's degrees or graduate certificates. With that said, though, of course, we want the course by itself to be useful and rewarding. We want you to learn some interesting information, have a bit of fun, and hopefully make connections with some of your fellow students. You may notice as well, for those who have been here before, a few changes to the IT Masters Learn platform, learn.itmasters.edu. We're hoping it's a better, sleeker experience for everyone, and we've tried to make it improved. For example, you can now reset your own passwords. Finally, I know that people used to get frustrated because they had to email us to do it. We have a plan in place to update a number of the courses that have been around for a little while now. You may see that 3 or 4 of the courses have been retired because they're a little bit old. And tonight's course is actually one of those. It more or less replaces the old Cisco CCNA Security short course, as that Cisco Security certificate is no longer offered. We hope that lots of you do go on to get your CyberOPS official certificate from Cisco after doing this course at some point as well. And as I said before, welcome to Lil in her usual moderation role. She's responsible for the learn.itmasters.edu.au website and the short courses email, which is where you'll find all the other materials needed for the course, links to the readings, discussions, forums, and quizzes. Matt will also probably make his presence felt in the forums at various points. If you have any questions tonight or later on, please feel free to contact us using the details on that page, or of course in the Q&A tonight. And finally, I have gone on for now 4 minutes. I said it was going to be 2. It's time to welcome Matt. Please join me in saying hello, and I will get out of your way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane, for that nice introduction, and welcome everyone to the first of our short courses for this year. So I've seen a few familiar names in the attendance list, so welcome to those who have had me before. For those of you that are not familiar with me or my background, I've been involved in the IT industry for quite a long time. I'm a bit of an old timer. I've spent a lot of time in the university system, both as a student, still currently as a student, but also teaching with the great crew at IT Masters for the last 17 years. One thing I do want to impress on you is I don't know everything, and there'll be many of you out there that will have questions that perhaps I may not be able to answer on the fly, but I'll always do my best to get you an answer within 24 to 48 hours. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions that you may have, and we can address them as appropriate. I'll let you read a little bit about more about me if you want to in the slide deck that is currently up on Moodle for this particular week. But I'm wary that usually in the first week of all these online courses, I tend to talk a lot and they go for an extended period of time. So I'm mindful of trying to get through everything in about an hour, although we might be a bit longer as usual. So outline for this course, if you haven't already seen it on Moodle. So week 1, we're here, cybersecurity fundamentals. Week 2, we're going to talk a little bit about cloud computing and the security aspects around cloud computing. Week 3 is access control models, and then week 4 is types of attacks and vulnerabilities, plus an opportunity to sit a final exam. Now, there are lots of resources for this course. There are some that are currently week 1 is available to you. There's numerous resources there, but I will add to those as we go through each week by week. Okay, so always make sure that you go back, and even if we get to the last week, go back and check week 1 to see if I've added some other resources as we sort of work our way through the course and people ask questions. Sometimes it's good to be able to say, hey, I've got a really good resource that can answer that direct question. I'll put them up for everyone's benefit. At a minimum, there will be lecture slides, so the PowerPoints are up there for you to have a look at. First week's is there now. There's some various readings. There may be some practical activities that will appear as appropriate depending on the particular topic. There's an online quiz for each week, which is 5 questions, multiple choice. You need to get 3 out of 5 to pass. You can do it as many times as you like. It doesn't contribute to your overall grade. So it just helps to get the brain going and help to prepare you for the final exam. Lots of extra online resources as well that will come up as we go through our discussion. This book here is the official Cisco CyberOPS Associate Study Guide. That's the Cisco exam number, so CBROPS 200-201. Now, at the end of this course, we will not have covered all of the material required for you to sit that exam. So if you have no experience and you're coming along to find out what CyberOPS is, that's fine. If you're aiming to get all the knowledge you need to pass the CyberOPS exam at the end of this course, unfortunately, we can't do that in 4 weeks. So basically, the outline for these 4 weeks are based off the first 4 modules of this particular study guide here. So, and I think from memory, there's about 16, 17 modules in it. So there's quite a way to go. It's a very all-encompassing exam, a very broad range of topics around security, and other network and operational characteristics are also included in that. So as I said, we cover some of the initial concepts of the Cisco CyberOPS Associate Certification, but not all of them. So it'll take you part of the way to being prepared, but certainly not all the way. It's also dependent on how much experience you have in this particular area as well. So if you're coming in completely new, then there's a lot of ground you would need to cover in order to pass that certification exam. I've taken bucket loads of Cisco security certification exams over the years, and they are quite challenging. So we don't cover all the material in this short course for that, but we give you a head start. If you want to know more information specifically about the exam, the training involved, and the actual content in terms of the topics and the topic weightings on the exam, you can go to this link here, which is also available through the slide presentation up on Moodle now. Also, just today, I put up a YouTube playlist, which will also give you a broader coverage of the topics in the CyberOPS certification. All right, so without any further delay, let's get into the introduction to cybersecurity. So what is the objective of cybersecurity? It's pretty basic and it's pretty straightforward. So we aim to protect everything: people, economies, schools, critical infrastructure, all types of organizations from any harm, either whether that be deliberate, accidental, through misuse, through compromisation, through some sort of attack, or through negligence. Okay, so it's all about protecting our digital systems. However, InfoSec is also something that we talk about as well, and we'll see on the next slide how these differ. One of the main things that I really want to impose on everyone or tell everyone is that the responsibility for cybersecurity, or indeed any sort of security in an IT perspective, so whether that's physical security, information security, cybersecurity, whatever, is everyone's responsibility. You can't have one team or one set person that is going to have complete responsibility over everything. Even as users or customers, we have responsibility to ensure that we're not doing things or getting phished, for example, or getting socially engineered. And so it's everyone's responsibility to keep an eye out for potential security attacks or things that could potentially lead to security attacks. So that's a really important thing to remember. It's everyone's responsibility. So cybersec and information security. These are often thought as being the same thing, just a different term for the same thing, but they're not. Because InfoSec primarily concentrates internally to an organization. Okay, so it's what you do within your organization to protect your systems and data and people against an attack or compromisation. Whereas cybersecurity recognizes that in this current world that we live in, our organizations are always interacting with other organizations that are outside our control, or other digital resources that are outside our control, like our cloud platforms or apps on smart devices that we have absolutely no control over. And so CyberSec recognizes that security is no longer an internal self-contained thing that we have control over. We have to keep it, we have to understand the content, the broader context in which we engage in our digital world. That's great from an interconnectivity perspective, right? So the internet and all of the Internet of Things and Internet of Everything and all these different business opportunities and information sharing opportunities around education, around research, around health, around improvements in our daily living, internet banking, all these sorts of services that we now have access to is great, but the downside of it is a much higher level of risk because we are connected to the internet. And to give you a couple of examples of that, in Australia in recent times, we've had a couple of compromised businesses. One was the Optus hack a little while ago, and there was a Medibank one that happened a little while ago. And the reason these occurred primarily was because systems that had been used internally for many years, many businesses now decide, hey, it's a great idea if we now webify these internal systems so that customers can have more access to their data and they can do more things. So instead of us having to do all that, customers can take that into their own hands, which is an advantage in some aspects. The problem is that when we try to retrofit security suitable for an online digital world to applications that are aging or are quite old or haven't been developed with that in mind, we often get disconnects and breakdowns in that security. And so this is where often these security hacks occur, not from what has been retrofitted to them to protect them in the online digital world, but what was developed many years ago and hasn't been fixed. And so to that end, our CyberSec programs have to be able to recognize that broader context. We have to maintain vigilance. We have to provide resiliency and redundancy in our systems. And we have to be able to protect ourselves against all these different ingress and egress points. Okay, because previously, for example, a perimeter of our network was considered that barrier between us and the internet. And that is no longer the case anymore. Our perimeters of our network or our data, the assets that we're trying to protect, can even be between us and other internal departments or extranet partners or integrators. It's no longer acceptable to just say that our border or our perimeter is protecting us, is a protection point between us and the internet. We have to look at it with a more holistic viewpoint. So CyberSec builds on top of InfoSec. So InfoSec, internal, CyberSec then takes into account the overall global context. And some extra bits and pieces are added into InfoSec to get to our CyberSec. And that includes risk management, threat intelligence and threat hunting, which we'll look at as we go through tonight and a little bit next week. Third-party software and hardware dependency management, so understanding where we have external software and hardware dependencies or reliance on either other parties or other systems, and the ability to provide an appropriate and agile response when an incident occurs, and to then understand how disaster recovery and business continuity fits into that paradigm. So disaster recovery and business continuity, in simple terms, disaster recovery is where we have an incident and it creates a major outage. The disaster recovery process is about getting back to full operational capacity. So that's one part of the process. At the same time, we have to keep business continuity moving, which means that we have to try and operate at some level while we are in this disaster stage. And both are very important and must be planned very heavily. All right, so frameworks. There's a couple of really good frameworks that there's some resources here and up on Moodle as well. And these are really commonly used cybersecurity frameworks. One comes from NIST, which is the National Institute of Security and Technology. It's an American organization, and it basically combines a collection of industry standards and best practices into a single workable framework that gives you a lot of advice and a lot of help in being able to implement cybersecurity policy or mitigations based on your own individual architecture. So it was created, it's a brainchild of the US government, other US corporations, and other cybersecurity individuals and experts. Even though it is developed by the US government and it is quite US centric in some of the legislation and that it talks around, the guidelines, it can still be implemented by anyone, anywhere in the world, and it's still valid. For something that's a little bit more open, I guess, you could also look at the ISO IEC 2700 framework. And these are published by these two organizations, the ISO and the IEC, and basically fit the same idea as the NIST cybersecurity framework. So they provide you with guidance on how to build a secure system. So it's really important that we understand threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits, what those three things are and how they relate to each other. So in simple terms, a threat is just any potential danger that can be directed at one of our assets, whether that's physical or so hardware, software, or physical. If we don't know about this threat, or alternatively, we know about it, but it hasn't yet been exploited by someone, then we say that it is latent. So it's a latent threat. If, however, it's currently being attacked by someone, we call that a realized threat. So the important terminologies to understand. The parties or people that attack us are known as malicious actors or threat actors. And these can be all different types of actors with all different types of motivations and reasons for attacking you. And we'll break those down as we go through over the next 4 weeks. The path that an attacker will use to attack you is known as either the threat agent or the threat vector. So the way in which they're going to attack you is what we call an agent or a vector. So that could be the type of attack or literally the direction in which they're going to attack you from, whether it's external, internal, or somewhere in between. This particular diagram comes from Sprint Seals. So there's the link there. And this is what they have come up with through surveys and discussions with industry experts on what's going to be the probable top 15 cybersecurity threats in this upcoming year. Not surprisingly, ransomware attacks is right at the top of the hit list. It's been very popular for a long time, and it has changed. Attackers have changed the way they do ransomware attacks over the last few years, from being simply locking things up so you couldn't use them to now locking things up so you can't use them and taking a copy of your data so that if you decide not to pay a ransom, they will then release that information. For some organizations, that can be quite important. Internet of Things. So we have all sorts of gadgets that connect to the internet that by and large don't have a whole lot of security on them and can lead to information leakage, which can then allow people to gather enough surveillance information on your system or on your personal life to be able to either steal your identity or launch some sort of attack against your systems. Social engineering and phishing attacks are always popular. The weakest link in our security is always our people, but it's always also it can be, if we tune it right, if we educate our people right, it can also be what I call the human firewall. So it can really assist us in developing our security. There's a range of other attacks there, threats. I'm not going to go through them all, but we will cover some of these more in detail as we go along. AI-powered cyber threats are probably only going to increase. AI is becoming more and more. At the moment, it's quite easy to detect AI-type attacks or to detect deep fakes and these sorts of things that we talk about as being generated by AI. But there will come a point in time where that won't be the case. The only other one I sort of really want to talk or just briefly mention was this APT, or Advanced Persistent Threats. So these are specialized organizations that are quite determined in the way they wish to attack certain organizations, and they continually do it all the time. And you can generally think of these guys as being like state-sponsored agencies. Obviously, in the Western world, we always blame the Chinese and the Russian hacking groups, but of course there is hacking groups on both sides of that divide, both Western and Eastern. And if you didn't think that was the case, then that would be a bit naive, I think. I can see, I'll just send a question there. So what's the difference between 5 and 11? 5 and 11 is AI-powered cyber threats. So they're literally cyber attacks that are powered by the use of AI, whereas AI misuse would be where you would try to use AI for some other purpose. So it might not necessarily be an attack, but it might be to otherwise socially engineer or phish, for example, someone within an organization or a particular organization. All right, let's move on. Vulnerabilities, simply put, are weaknesses that are inside our system for some reason, whether that's due to the actual design, the implementation, the software, the hardware, or the configuration of the system itself, or perhaps through the usage practices of that particular system. So it's just a weakness that can potentially be compromised. So a really simple example is having a weak password policy. So that opens up the possibility of a brute force password attack, as an example. And these, as it says here, can take a whole range of they can take a whole range of different forms. So it could just be that a product is particularly poorly designed, or that's been designed or written, like, as I said before, with the Optus hack or Medibank, it may be that a system was written for internal use only with no account of security, and then it's been retrofitted with a front end to allow internet access to it for people to access to it. So then it's not necessarily going to be secure. An offshoot of that, or the follow-on from that, is we have a term mitigations. The mitigations are the tools, mechanisms, policies, coding, practices, whatever you want to call them, that we put in place to reduce the likelihood to either remove those vulnerabilities, so to fix them completely, or alternatively to reduce the likelihood of them being exploited sometime down the future. Common types of security vulnerabilities, there's some of them here. Some of them, and this is just sort of building on the previous slide. So again, this is taken from Spiceworks, and this is not an exhaustive slide. This is not the only security vulnerabilities that could possibly exist, but these are some of the common types that you might see, and some of these we'll look at when we get to week 4, when we talk about threats and vulnerabilities and attacks in a little bit more detail. Cybersecurity industry experts, vendors, and researchers assign what are called identifiers to vulnerabilities for public release. So what that means is once a vulnerability becomes known, experts, vendors, and researchers assign them an identity, often known as a CVE, so a common vulnerability and exposure identifier. And then we publish them on websites to allow people to research what potential vulnerabilities or what vulnerabilities exist in the wild, and how we and give us advice on how we might be able to mitigate those particular vulnerabilities. So this is a really important research aspect of the industry, because remember, cybersecurity is quite, or infosecurity or any sort of security, is quite reactive, particularly in the digital environment, because even if a vulnerability exists and we don't know about it, remember that's called a latent vulnerability or a latent exploit. If we don't know about it, then and don't know it exists, then we can't protect against it. It's only when someone attacks it, which is, Alex, thank you for your question, what a zero-day attack is. So a zero-day attack is when someone launches an attack against a vulnerability that previously hasn't been known. So it's literally the first time that particular attack has ever been implemented against that vulnerability, in simple terms. So once that happens, that vulnerability then becomes public or identifiable, and we get to this process where we give it an identifier, we publish it, we publish all the details we know about it, and potentially what you can do to fix it or to mitigate against that vulnerability being exploited again. Exploits are simply software, tools, techniques, processes that exploit vulnerabilities in order to gain access to a system they shouldn't have, to escalate privileges, or to otherwise deface, take down, disrupt the use of a particular target system. A really, really common attack sequence, or modus operandi, if you want to call it, particularly for state-sponsored type threat actors, is to gain initial access and then what we call laterally move. So instead of gaining access to a single stiff system and staying there, they'll gain access to that system, which will then allow them to potentially gain access to other systems internally, and then they will have multiple ingress points into that network from which to launch attacks. And so when you try to defend against that, it's a constant race to find out where these attackers have got into and how do we get them out. So it's a very common thing. They gain access, they laterally move, they escalate their privileges to root access or God mode, and then they try to do whatever it is they need to do. So it might be to stay in your system quietly and remove information, to steal information, or it could be they're trying to do something really destructive. As I said, zero-day exploits are those that target currently unknown vulnerabilities. So we don't know what the vulnerability is as yet. Someone comes along, finds it through this process of just reconnaissance, and attackers are always looking all the time. They find a new vulnerability, that then exploit it, that then becomes a zero-day, known as a zero-day exploit. Risks and assets is another important component. So a risk is the probability or likelihood of the occurrence of realization of a threat. So in simple terms, that means what's the likelihood of our vulnerability being attacked? That's what it comes down to. And there are 3 basic elements that we must build when we talk about our risk management or identification of risk. And they are firstly our assets. So that is, what is it we are trying to protect in terms of our digital assets? What are the threats to that particular asset? So what sort of hackers might be potentially targeting us? And why would they be targeting us? And then our vulnerabilities are what are the weaknesses that are associated with those particular assets that we're trying to protect. And we need to obviously consider all of those in our risk management. Obviously, we need to know what we're trying to protect. And then we need to know within that asset that we're trying to protect, what are the weaknesses that are inherent in that system? And then from that, we can understand what sort of exploits could be launched against it. The threats, or who the threat actors are, is relatively easy, or can be relatively easy to identify in some cases. So for example, if you are a company that specializes in a particular industry-leading product, then a potential threat actor might be a competitor, or it might be someone that wants to steal your designs and sell them for themselves, or sell them to the highest bidder. So sometimes it can be easy to identify threat actors, other times it can be a little more problematic. So some threat examples, and this is not exhaustive. Now, these are interesting because, as you can hopefully see, not all of them are to do with digital hackers. So yes, hacker attacks are there, and cyber attacks and viruses, disclosure of confidential information, denial of service, distributed denial of service. They are all valid digital-based attacks. But what about natural disasters that we've got up in Queensland at the moment, with the cyclones coming in, unfortunately? They can cause absolutely catastrophic damage as well. So that's a threat. How do we protect against that? That's where physical security in particular comes into it, and disaster recovery, business continuity planning, redundancy, those sorts of things. That's a conversation for a very different time. The point is, there are lots of different ways lots of different threats and lots of different ways in which we can be attacked. Our threat or malicious actors usually fall into these categories, one of these categories. Script kiddies are people that are just playing around, don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge, although they can have, and they're just in it for a quick thrill or to prove how clever they are, for example. Organised crime groups, wherever there is value in an asset, there will be organised crime groups potentially coming to exploit that asset. Their main driving force is to make money. Okay, whatever way that is, whether that's steal information, sell it to someone else, or to use it for their own profit. State sponsors and governments. So these guys are interested in stealing data from major infrastructure manufacturers, government agencies, defence contractors, for example. These are the sorts of threat actors that most of us are not going to encounter on a day-to-day basis. Hacktivists, people that have some sort of social or political cause. Anonymous is one that is a hacktivist group that you'll see commonly in the news. And then lastly, terrorist groups motivated by political or some other religious ideology. So they're the potential, that's generally they're the main categories of malicious actors that might threaten us. So you've got to work out within the context of your own organisation, which one of these or more apply to you, and they might. Then we have our threat intelligence, which we mentioned on one of the earlier slides. So this is basically knowledge about existing or emerging threats to our assets, including our networks and systems. So threat intelligence, you can think of it as being a general thing as well, where we have organizations such as CrowdStrike is one in particular that will develop lots of threat intelligence around all the different emerging threats and currently out in the wild threats that exist. And they'll find out, they'll build a database of which threat actors are using which attack vectors and different types of attacks to attack certain vulnerabilities and certain organizations. And they'll collate that into a big database that they can then use both in their own business, but also publish for other people to access and gain an understanding of how, as individual companies, we might be attacked as well. Included in that threat intelligence includes the context. So in other words, maybe what country, what sort of threat actor might be interested in your particular business, and of course, the particular information or types of assets that you may have within your organization. Mechanisms. So how are you going to be attacked? What sort of types of attacks might be implemented against you, and what tools might be potentially used? Indicators of compromise. So an IOC is simply something within your system that indicates that it has been compromised. So it may be a whole lot of, for example, locked accounts it might be an indicator that someone has been trying to brute force your password database. It might be file bloat. So maybe all of a sudden your database has all of a sudden grown to a huge size, which is completely unusual. So there might be something going there. Alternatively, it could be that the file is now shrunk a lot. It could be the presence of unusual files or new files that are appearing without particular attributes that are assigned to users within your organization. So just appearing randomly. But there's lots of them. Okay, there could be extra traffic coming through a firewall that normally hasn't appeared. It might be attempts to gain access to your VPN. It might be closed circuit TV vision of someone of something unusual happening around the outside of your building, or someone trying to scope out your building to see whether they can break in. All those sorts of things are potential indicators of compromise. So it doesn't just have to be a digital thing. It can also be a physical thing as well. I think we need to keep that in mind. Implications are basically saying, well, what happens if this attack occurs and it's successful? How is that going to affect our organization? And then actionable advice. So what can we do in order to either reduce the risk of this particular threat occurring, or to get back to respond to it if it is to happen, and how can we get back to full operational capacity? These threat intelligence notifications will also include specifics on the TTPs, so tactics, techniques, and procedures that threat actors will use, okay, based on a particular vulnerability and an attack. So the primary purpose is to provide information about the risks, and if those risks occur, what the implications are for your organization. All right, I'll just pause for a second to have a look at some of the questions, and then we'll move on to the next section. Copy of the presentation, yes, that's available up on Moodle, so that's already there. Are software exploit developers condemned by law? Depends on the jurisdiction. I wouldn't say they would be everywhere, but in most cases, if you are developing exploits, then that is generally seen as an illegal function in most places, so it would be frowned upon. The Essential 8, Stuart, is not something that we cover in detail in this particular course. We keep to the outline from the Cisco CyberOPS, so that's not something that Cisco use too much, as it's an Australian thing. Why is it easier to detect an AI-generated attack as opposed to a non-AI-generated operated attack? What I was actually referring to there was that it's easy to see things that have been, it can be easy to see there are tools available to be able to discern when AI has been used to create something false. Okay, so not necessarily an attack, but some sort of documentation or a video like these deep fakes. There's tools available that will help you to detect those sort of things. In terms of attacks, it's not quite that simple, for sure.
Hey, Matt, I think it would be good to answer Rob's question as well about how CyberOps compares to the older CCNA security. I know you went through it with me some time ago when we talked about this course. What do you think about that one?
Okay, so well, it's very different. So CyberOps, so CCNA security focused more on specific Cisco product lines and specific Cisco coding. So, for example, the old ASA firewalls and their intrusion detection systems, their VPN products, how to implement access control lists and that sort of thing on their routers and switches. So mainly talking about either software, their software configurations, their best practices, and their hardware products. In CyberOps, what we talk more about, the CyberOps certification is more around concepts. So security fundamentals, cloud security, threats and vulnerabilities, understanding risk management. Yes, in some of the technical modules, there is discussion obviously about Cisco products. I mean, they're trying to sell their products as well, but it's not quite so specifically Cisco. It's a little bit more generic, and I think that's a really good improvement. A lot of the really successful and really highly valued Cisco security certifications in the industry are those that are generic. So that is, you can take the skills that you learn from them and you can apply them across multiple contexts using any sort of vendor platform. In the older Cisco certifications, and this applies to not just the security certifications, but their other ranges as well, it was very Cisco-centric. And so the skills that you learned from them could be applied in concept potentially to other vendors, but practically it was difficult to do that. You would have to go and relearn some other skills. So it's becoming a little bit more generic. It's a little bit more broad focused, and CyberOps in particular also focuses on operational, so security operational centers and how they implement security for their customers and how they manage their customers' networks, as opposed to giving you skills that you can implement security mitigations on your own. So I think that's a pretty good summary of the differences. No, I wouldn't. So Steve said CCNA sounds more technical, CyberOps more for managers. I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think it's just a different type of technical person. So CyberOps it's a different sort of role. So in CyberOps, you're sitting in a security operations center monitoring customers. So you're going through your monitoring systems, you're looking at threat intelligence, you're gathering threat intelligence, you're looking for indicators of compromise, you're responding to incidents, you're mitigating things. Whereas in CCNA security, it was more around applying specific tools and mechanisms to prevent or try to reduce the risk of attacks occurring. So it was more around mitigation. This is more around monitoring, reporting, and mitigation as well. So Splunk is a totally different product altogether. So Splunk is basically what we call big data. So it gathers information. In essence, it gathers data from a lot of different sources, usually logs and those sorts of things, information repositories within your organization, and it spits them out into a form that you can intelligently understand and apply what Splunk is telling you to your day-to-day operations. Would there be an InfoSec team in a government organization? In most government organizations, yes, will have their own internal information security team. Absolutely. Should have anyway. But yeah. Looks like CyberOps is similar to cybersecurity from ISC2. Is this the case? It's similar in some aspects, more Cisco-centric though, obviously. But it is similar. All right, let me just move on because I'm mindful of time. I know there's a couple other questions there. I'll see if I can get to them.
I think you've really
there's only
through
one.
a lot of them.
Yeah, there's only
3 left at the moment.
Okay, so the user one, identifying users is the weakest link. So the best way to get around those users is education. So we're talking about security awareness training and proper training, and that's not just for people who are in an IT operational sort of capacity, but also our general users as well. All right, let me get on to this one. So network security systems. So what does this include? Things like firewalls, whether they be traditional, next generation, or personal. Intrusion detection systems, Traditional and next generation intrusion prevention systems, which are really IDS, intrusion detection and prevention, is by and large the same thing nowadays. Anomaly detection systems, so that is systems that will detect strange things that are not usually occurring in your network that might be occurring. AMP, so advanced malware protection, web security appliances, email security appliances, identity management systems, so to confirm and authenticate users or devices that are connecting to your network. Some of these we will look at in more detail through our resources and through our subsequent topics. But to just give you some basic examples, here we've got a traditional firewall deployment where we have a trusted or inside connection and an untrusted outside connection, which connects to the internet. So this is I think, what most people will think of when you talk about firewalls. Okay, so providing that border between the inside and outside worlds. That's just traditional firewalling. Again, we've got advanced malware protection here. So we have these different devices, and I'm not going to go through all these devices, but these are all Cisco, obviously Cisco provided devices. These pictures are coming from the CyberOPS Associate Official Certification Guide, so you'd expect that. But they have a range of platforms, including firewalls, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, web security, email security, that feed into these management consoles that are then allow these systems to look at the traffic and the information that's flowing in and out of your network to determine what's not quite right. We have an intrusion detection system in what's called an out-of-band implementation. So in this case, it's out of band because the traffic that's going through the network is not going directly through the IDS. It's being copied to the IDS, which is then generating potential alerts to the management system. If this IDS was to be here, a module within that switch, then we would say it would be in line. So it is in line with the traffic flow. And then in this last one, we've got our SMA. Okay. Oh no, we don't have that mentioned there. So this is a distributed system which allows all of these web and email related security systems to report back to a centralized system, a management agent, which can then provide you with reporting on what's going on in your web and email type deployments. So these are all examples of tools that can be applied in a network sense, so to protect your network as a whole rather than individual devices. A data loss prevention system, one of which Cisco, of course, has one called Cisco Umbrella. And these systems provide the ability to detect sensitive emails, documents, or information as it leaves your organization. Okay, there are lots of other DLP products in the marketplace, including a lot of these guys over here. But fundamentally, what DLP does is it tries to protect your information while it's at rest. So in other words, being stored, when it's in transit, so being transit through email or some other file transfer mechanism, or when it's in process, so it's inside your processing system. So it's being processed by a CPU on some device somewhere. And that's all DLP is, a system that monitors for actions, so unauthorized actions on your data somewhere, whether it's at work, rest, or play, so to speak. Cisco actually doesn't stand for anything in particular. It's just the name. It's just the name of the company. All right, let's move on to principles of defense in depth. The defense in depth strategy or idea is based on the belief that more layers of digital security are more difficult to penetrate. So the more layers you have, the more difficult it is, not impossible, but the more difficult it is for an intruder to penetrate your system. And therefore, you hope that they give up and they go on to a different, easier target. Okay. We can have lots of different layers around our data. So we can have application security, so protecting the individual application that accesses that data. We can have host security, so on the individual device itself. Network security, so we're talking about firewalls, IDS, web and email type security. Perimeter security, so we've got our firewalls, segmentation, VLANs, those sorts of things. Our physical security, cameras, locks, guard dogs, guards, physical guards. And then we've got our non-technical around our policies and our planning. So business continuity, disaster recovery, secure password policies, acceptable use policies, and our security awareness training. Those sorts of things. So the more of those we have in place, the more difficult it is for attackers to get into our network. So for those of you that have seen Shrek, as he says to Donkey, ogres are like onions. Ogres have layers, onions have layers. Right, now the real fundamental, the CIA Triad. These three things that we're talking about now are the main tenets of digital security. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This is a very simple model. There are much more complex models, such as the Macumber cube. Okay, that's one in particular that is often people often ask about. But there are many other security models, but this one is very simple, very easy to understand, very easy to implement. So from a fundamental perspective, this is the go-to. It talks about having these three pillars around your information security or your cybersecurity. Confidentiality is just making sure that our information is not shared with anyone that it should not be shared with. So it's keeping our information secret. We only give it to those people who are authorized to have it. Integrity is about making sure that your data is always accurate and it's not changed in an unauthorized manner. So it's not changed from the original secure copy. And then lastly, availability simply means that systems are available to authorized users whenever they want them. So things like denial of service can prevent availability. Someone breaking into your system and stealing your information goes against confidentiality. Someone breaking into your system and changing some of your information for whatever purpose is an attack against integrity. Now, it is possible these can exist altogether, as they can also be compromised altogether, but they are not all reliant on each other. So what I mean by that is you can still maintain your confidentiality and availability, but someone may have broken in and changed files in an unauthorized manner. And so you've lost your integrity, but you still have confidentiality and availability, okay, as an example. So it's possible, hopefully they all exist at the same time. So we have confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all our systems, but it's possible that one or more of those can be compromised at any one time. And it could be that they're compromised on a single system, but not on another. All right, let's move on. Risk and risk analysis. We've already defined risk, so we already know what that is. But in the world of cybersecurity, we define risk as a possibility of something bad happening. And there are lots of standards and methodologies for classifying and analyzing risk, including these particular two here. Okay, but there's lots of different ways in which we can classify risk. Risk analysis is about determining these 5 things. So this comes from the NIST cybersecurity framework. And we need to remember that it's an ongoing cyclical process. So we have to establish a risk context, and that is what sort of business are we in? What sort of network do we have? What sort of users do we have? Who are our customers? So we identify our assets. We identify what we're trying to protect. We can perform quantitative or qualitative assessment. Often it is not possible to do a full quantitative assessment. Quantitative means that we assign a specific value, usually in dollars, to the different components of risk. And sometimes when we get to components of risk like probability or likelihood, we can't apply a quantitative value to that. And so we say that quantitative assessment is a totally quantitative assessment is largely impossible. Qualitative assessment, however, is when we start to build scenarios and think about our vulnerabilities and say, all right, this is how we think this vulnerability could be attacked by this particular threat agent and this threat vector. Let's work through the process to determine what our overall risk is. And so we build a narrative, if you like, about what's happening. We don't try to base it on specific dollar values. We wait until we determine what the narrative is. We build a story of what could possibly happen, and then we assign some values after that. We then have to come up with treatments. So how do we stop this risk from occurring? Or how do we mitigate the risk, either stop it or lessen the impact of it? We need to communicate with all the different parties that are involved. So that's management, our users, our customers, our other business partners, whoever might be involved. We then have to monitor, review the risks, treatments, our obligations, and all the other criteria that we need to consider on a constant basis. So it's not just let's do a risk analysis, apply some mitigations and forget about it, because new vulnerabilities come along, new attacks come along all the time, and we have to be agile in the way in which we respond to those. Our obligations, risk and treatments and criteria are reasonably straightforward. Obligations can be related to either contracts that we have in place with other parties, or it might be to do with legislation or governance requirements, depending on the industry we're in. And then, of course, we need to respond as required to this monitor, review, and all this other analysis and assessment that we've done. So it's a constant, ongoing problem. So what are we trying to protect? Often we're trying to protect some sort of information. And PII, personally identifiable information, and PHI, protected health information, are the two main categories of information which all security certifications and all security departments or integrators are trying to protect. So PII, personally identifiable information, is any information that can be used to distinguish or trace the identity of an individual. So it's very specific to you, so it can completely identify who you are, including your name, maybe. Chances are there's someone else in the world that's got exactly the same name. I know with my name, I know of at least 10 people in the world that have exactly the same name as I am, and who are actually born on the same day. But it could be some other biological or personal characteristics, okay, that might be stored somewhere in terms of information. Might be a date of a birth, our mother's maiden name, credit card numbers, other banking information, our driver's license number or social security number if you're in the States, our individual address, our phone numbers, perhaps places we've worked before, friends that we have, places that we frequent. And when you think about it, a lot of this information, not all of it, but a lot of this information is in places like Facebook. It's readily, easily accessible to people. And that's why identity theft is actually extremely easy to accomplish. Health information is similar, but it specifically relates to medical records. So it can include medical records from your doctor or hospital or other healthcare practitioner, can include details about any acute or chronic health conditions that you may have, or anything that's existed in your past, in your present, or perhaps future details of healthcare. So maybe operations that you might be booked in to have, or some other healthcare plan that you might be on, for example. So this type of information, both these categories of information, there's a lot of effort by all organizations to keep this secret, because if a lot of this information gets out, it's not just, like you might say, well, I don't care if someone knows my name and date of birth and mother's maiden name. Who cares? That's really easy to get access to. Yes, but if they have all of those pieces of information in the one spot and they're grabbed, they can use that to potentially ring up a supplier of yours. So say a telecommunications, you've got a phone and you've got a telecommunications provider. If they've got some information, they might be able to ring up and pretend they're you and get that number ported to a different telecommunication. They steal your number. This happens all the time. It's far more common than people think. Or they steal your identity in other ways, to take out a bank loan, to take out a credit card, run up bills in your name, which then come back to haunt you in later years. So it's a really important thing to keep protected and to understand the importance of it. Some other principles of security which are really important as well include least privilege. So the principle of least privilege simply states that all users, whether they individually contribute to a task, or they are a manager or a director or any executive or anyone else, they should only have the level of access they need to do their jobs and no more. So that means you only get access to the resources, digital resources that you need, the systems you need in order to be able to perform your job to its requirements. You don't get any access any more than that. So for example, a sales account manager really has no business having administrative privileges over the network. Why would they need that? They're not a network administrator, they don't need it. If you're a call center staff member, you wouldn't have access over critical corporate financial detail or access to the accounts. If you have a program or process running on a system, it should only have enough access to be able to get its job done. So talking about system accounts or other processes that run on an automatic basis in the background, they should only be able to have access or the level of rights they need to perform their task. They don't need root access or God-mode access. Separation of duties is a particular administrative control that simply says that no one single person should perform all critical or privilege level duties. So those critical or privilege level duties should be split among multiple individuals, which means that they would have to collude in order to be able to exploit those particular critical or privilege level access rights. So we separate these tasks among several individuals within an organization rather than have one person in charge. Now, in small organizations, that's really difficult, but in larger organizations, that is pretty normal. So the goal simply is to stop one person from upsetting everything. You need some form of collusion between multiple people, and the more people you have involved in that, the less likely that is, or the more difficult it is for them all to collude together. And there's a couple of examples of that. So security auditors that are responsible for keeping tabs on our security system, so reviewing logs, shouldn't necessarily have the ability to administer those logs. So in other words, delete events or change events to cover something they might be doing. Or network administrators should not have the ability to alter logs on the system as well, for the same reasons. They make a change. Oh no, I did something wrong. Quick, let's delete that out of the log so no one knows that I did it. Separation of duties. So a particular focus of CyberOPS in the Cisco certification is this concept of security operations centers. So these are simply facilities where the digital assets, which include applications, databases, servers, and networks in our desktops and any other endpoints, are monitored, assessed, and protected. Now, this might be a security operations center that is run by your organization internally, or it could be outsourced to another company or third party. In order to establish this SOC requires a lot of planning because there's a lot of organizational challenges that will be specific to your particular organization, depending on governance and legislation that applies to your particular industry or organization or policy within that organization. All organizations will collaborate with other different parties, and they may have requirements or they may have expectations, or you may have expectations of them. And then, of course, there may be lack of tools, a lack of automation, threat intelligence, or skill sets. So this is often why security operations centers are outsourced to other companies rather than held internally. You need to be a big organization with a lot of capability and a lot of money in order to be able to set up a well-managed, well-practiced security operations center. So a security operations center can help you with answering some of these questions. So how can you detect a compromise in a timely manner? A security operations center has systems and processes in place to be able to enable you or enable compromises to be detected in a timely manner. So, for example, CrowdStrike have a guarantee that they will, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's something along the lines of they will detect an incident or a compromise within 5 minutes, and they will have it remediated within 60 minutes. It's something like that. It's a pretty stringent level, and the vast majority of times they will meet that objective. Another question, how do you triage a compromise to determine the severity and scope? Again, security operations centers had dedicated staff and systems and knowledge and threat intelligence in place in order to be able to answer that particular question. Same with the impact of the compromise to your business. Threat intelligence helps to answer that question because it's based on other organizations that have suffered the same consequences. Who is responsible for detecting and mitigating that compromise? The staff and the systems within that security operations center. Who should be informed or involved? How do you, and when do you deal with compromise once detected? That's all covered in the incident response plan, disaster recovery, business continuity, incident response team formation. All of that is documented and communicated through that security operations center. So it's all based on this heavy planning. And how and when should you communicate a compromise internally or externally? And is that needed in the first place? So again, that will be dependent on your individual business, your individual organization, and the industry that you're in. You may actually have governance and legislative requirements that if a compromise occurs, you must notify someone. You must notify a government authority or some sort of other incident response team. Or you may be able to go, well, it's just an internal system. We're not particularly particularly governed by any sort of legislation or any other organisation. We don't have to address it.
Hey,
The
Matt.
following.
Sorry,
Sorry, Sam.
I just thought I'd interrupt for a second. We're about 9:15 nearly now, 9:11. We'll probably close the questions in about 4 or 5 minutes. Will that work in with your timing?
Yeah, it will. I've only got about 6 or 7 slides to go.
Great. So look, we'll close the questions off, say at about 9:15 or a little bit later. So if you've got questions, pop them in the Q&A now, everybody, because I'm well aware that lots of people want to get going. Thanks.
Thanks, Shane. All right. So following a requisite to build a security operations center, you need to have management agreement, executive agreement. Okay. If you don't have that, it's not going to go anywhere. The operations center will operate as a program. So organizations have to operate the SOC as a program rather than as a single project. So it's ongoing. And it's a program whereby we have to constantly monitor, evaluate to determine its effectiveness and update it. Be agile with it. A governance structure. So you have to establish some form of metric or service level agreement around what is going to tell us whether our security operations center is operating to our expectations and what do we need to ensure that we can measure that accurately. Effective team collaboration. Obviously, lots of people have input into the security operations center and it has communication responsibilities to a lot of people outside of that. So it's important that all the teams involved with it collaborate nicely together and well together in order to be able to set the basic ground rules for success. Access to data and systems. Obviously, an operations center has to have access to the systems it's trying to protect in order to install agents or other mitigations or other reporting type modules. Applicable processes and procedures to document who does what when an incident occurs, how the communication flows, how we get back to full operational capacity. Obviously, a sufficiently skilled team with experience, skill sets, and tools at their disposal. And budget, as always, is going to be a very heavily influencing factor. All right, just quickly, last few slides. Playbooks, runbooks, and runbook automation. So what's this about? Organizations need to have the capability to define, build, orchestrate, so deploy and implement, manage and monitor the different processes and workflows that make up their security paradigm. And they do this by the implementation of playbooks, runbooks, and through automating their runbooks through RBA. A runbook is simply a collection of processes, procedures, and operations which can be performed by administrators, security operatives, network operators, or other technical staff. So it just gives them a way of dealing with a particular operational incident as it occurs. And it provides metrics to measure how effective the processes and procedures within that runbook have been at the conclusion of the implementation. Some possible metrics that we might measure include mean time to repair. So what's the average time it takes to get back to a normal state? Mean time between failures. How often do failures or compromises in this particular system or asset we're trying to protect, how often do they occur? How long does it take us to discover that a security incident has occurred? If it takes us weeks, that's useless. If it takes seconds or minutes, much better. How long does it take us to contain or mitigate a security incident? So when we're talking about CrowdStrike before, it takes them, they guarantee they will discover a security incident within 5 minutes and they will mitigate it within 60. Pretty good. And then how do we automate the provision of IT resources in order to respond to incidents as they occur? So the RBA solutions, okay, there are lots of different runbook automation solutions available in the industry. One popular one is Rundeck. There's others as well, but Rundeck is a very popular one. And so all they're really doing, all RBA system is it takes the processes and procedures and operations that are written down in a runbook and they automate as many of those processes and procedures as they can to increase efficiency, increase agility, and increase time to response. So speed things up. Instead of having people having to do it manually, it automates it all. So there's also a link here which will give you information around some open source examples of playbooks and some RBA resources which might be interesting to you to have a look at. These are not specific to the CyberOPS exam, but they're just some more information there for you to actually have a look at. So in short, a runbook is just a system of processes and procedures, and then automating that is what an RBA does. And that is really all we need to talk about tonight. There's some learning tasks for you this week. So most of you have already done this. Introduce yourself on discussion forums. Make sure you review the resources on the course site. If you're not here, obviously if you're not here, this isn't going to mean much to you, but you need to watch this presentation. And then when you feel ready, have a go at the Module 1 Quizlet. That will actually open at midnight tonight. All right, so let's have a look at some of those questions. Shane, did you want to interrupt with something? Yeah?
I was going to suggest that on that second last slide, that link to the incidentresponse.org, we had a few people saying it doesn't work. I couldn't get it to work. I got a 404. Yeah, I got a 404 on that.
Oh, okay, so I'll check that out and update that. I apologize for that. That was working the other day when I grabbed it. So
yeah, somebody else said they got it, but I couldn't for some reason. Maybe
okay, so someone has said they can get it, and okay, or I'll check it out.
Yeah,
I'll check it out and update it as necessary.
No worries. Thanks, mate.
Thanks for letting me know.
I think with the questions, one of the ones that's always been interesting is, has working from home increased, means that peripheral assets have become more vulnerable? Have you got lots of examples of that? Because I'm assuming the answer is yes.
I haven't got any personal examples of that, but there's no, I think it would be, in terms of if you look at industry reports, and even if you just think about it logically, there's no doubt that working from home has increased the risk of exploit, not necessarily the exploitation of vulnerabilities, but it's certainly increased the risk. And that's simply because in many cases, either one or two things, if companies provide devices that are appropriately secured to their workers and they take that home and they use that to work, then that's a little less risky. But we've still got that internet connection, that home interconnection, and the home usually some sort of Wi-Fi connection to that internet connection, which can represent an elevated risk. Alternatively, if we have users at home that are just using their own equipment to access their remote resources, even if that's via some sort of TLS-based web portal, then clearly that's going to present an even higher elevated risk because we don't have control of that device. So anytime you're allowing your systems to be accessed from devices over which you have no administrative or security control, then that is clearly going to elevate the risk. I don't have any particular examples I can think of where that has been a major, like any major disruption of a particular organization that's been publicized, but I can tell you from experience with contracting into as a consultant into some local government organizations, local LGAs, local government agencies, so local councils in recent times, that this is can be a big concern. And even more of a concern when you consider that a lot of local government agencies may have services that they offer or are associated with, but don't necessarily control. So one example I can think of is animal relief shelters, okay, or basically an old dog pound, what we used to call dog pounds, are run by government or authorized or facilitated by local government agencies, but not necessarily managed or run by local government employees. And so you get a range of, and then you've got to worry about what we call shadow IT. So IT resources that are out there that we don't have control of and we have no knowledge of. And of course, if they're compromised, then that can elevate your risk of being attacked. And that has occurred in quite a few of the LGAs that I've recently consulted in, where they've had help in the home type organizations where they have the medical staff or carers will be contracted to go to certain customers, if you like, or clients to help them with, either sort of meals or cleaning duties. They're generally elderly or disabled people. And often those agencies are staffed by people with their own digital resources. And so there's been times when council facilities have been compromised because of something that's happened there, either access that they shouldn't have had, or viruses or malware, those sorts of things.
By the way, I discovered the answer to the that link. It does work. The problem is all our browsers automatically assume it's HTTPS and try and find it.
Indeed.
And that's what happens if you don't go back in and delete a little less. Anyway,
Okay,
I thought Blue Corbell's question was actually a bit of a joke at the time because it came around with the yoga thing. Do we go into things like using tails since we're talking about onions?
No, we don't go into using tails. No.
Excellent.
If I think that if I'm assuming that's talking about the Linux type tails and that type of implementation. If that's what that question was about, that's what I'm assuming. Otherwise,
because he's given us a lot of good information in the chat. Do you know about Eisenhower's quadrant?
I actually don't, to be honest. Can we use Eisenhower's quadrant, important and urgent, to choose what we want to protect? I'm not overly familiar with that. So I can't answer that live, but I will find an answer for you. It's probably just something, the name is familiar to me, but I can't think of a detailed answer in response to that at this stage, but I'll look that up for you.
Yeah, I think it's that thing that if the two scales are urgent and important, and if something's not urgent but really important, that's the thing that keeps you awake at night.
Oh, okay, right. That's okay. Right, gotcha.
Explain the difference between proactive and reactive approaches in SOC operations. Is that
proactive is simply as it says. I mean, it's relatively straightforward. So reactive is basically when you're still monitoring systems and looking at what's going on, but you're basically monitoring systems and waiting for something to happen. Proactive is when you actually start looking deeply within the system a little bit more. So in most security, so if we say a typical implementation of a security operations center would be that we would install agents on all of the items, all the digital resource that we're trying to protect, and they would report back everything that's going on that system, including all the process calls and all the interactions with different clients and services. They would report that back to our centralized system, which we would then collate everything and start to generate alerts and show us what's going on in real time. So reactive is when we're just sort of waiting for, more or less waiting for something to happen, say for an alarm bell to pop up, and then we react to that. Proactive is when we may either suspect something's going on, but we're not quite sure, or we may just want to investigate on a higher level, something that's not necessarily an alarm bell, but something that's maybe potentially a little unusual, or alternatively, we may be on a regular basis, say monthly or quarterly or something, we might start to jump onto a system and have a look at what's going on to see if anything unusual has occurred that we haven't picked up. Because that's always possible. Our systems aren't perfect, and particularly with zero-day attacks, things might be laying there, and there might be something that's being compromised and something that's happening in the background, but we don't know about it yet. And so proactive is that just simply going in and starting to look and doing some analysis and investigation, whereas reactive is what we do after an event. So we're really sort of pre and post is probably the simple answer to that one.
Look for those Russian sleeper agents.
Exactly.
RTO and RPO, is that something?
So yeah, return time objective and report and return point objective. So so I'm not exactly sure what that question is about, to be frank. So the point objective is, a time objective is how long can we stand pressure before we must get back to operation at a certain level, okay? So RTO is how long can we go in an incident and things not working before we must have it working again. So that might be measured in minutes, hours, weeks, days, depending on what the sort of system is we're talking about. The recovery point objective is the place within the actual system itself that we have to return to in order to be satisfied that we've got past events. So in other words, if we have a database system and someone attacks it and they destroy all the data in it, the recovery point objective is stating how much of that data we have to get back before we can return to operation, as an example. So it might be we have to get 50% of the data back before we're happy, or it might be we have to get 100% of the data back before we're happy. So that's a difference between a recovery time objective and a recovery point objective.
Excellent. And I think on that note, it's time to say thank you, Matt. That's been really good to hear this, and I see there's been a lot of really good content in the chat tonight too. So I'm glad that we're uploading the chat to the transcript to the site as well for everybody to have a look at, because there's lots of logs and lots of chats, a lot of good people who actually know a lot about all this stuff as well.
I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's people out there who know a lot more than I do. So your comments are always welcome and your interactions are always welcome. Just want to, just last thing, just to apologize. First week always goes over with the intro and everything. So the next 3 weeks will be more right on time. So looking forward to discussing our next topic on cloud security next week. So thank you everyone for this evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to the team, Kit, Lynn, and Shane for their contribution and making things work so smoothly. Thank you again. You're a bunch of legends.
It's all, you make it real easy, Matt, but thank you so much. And thanks, Lil, and good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.